Friends, welcome to Pacific Palisades, California. It has been an incredibly long time since you and I looked at the S90 Volvo sedan. And in that time, there's been a number of new Volvos you and I have driven, as well as some other cars that compete with it from other manufacturers. So I feel it's high time that we take a second look at this car and do it with a completely different eye. Look at it from a pragmatic, prudent point of view, as if you were living with it every day. Now as we tool through downtown Pacific Palisades here, trying to catch up to a Porsche 911 Turbo S convertible, which is kind of the thing that people have around here, it makes me think about premium. Remember that conversation we had with Stefan back in Spain? Not when we drove this, when we drove the XC60, and he kept on focusing on premium. Well, now here's the thing about that. Premium! It should be more than a term bandied about by marketing folks. It should be a tangible attribute or asset. Which brings our discussion to a riddle. What does this, or really Volvo's four-cylinder strategy, what can it learn from Jeff Bezos and Amazon? For those of you that don't follow me on Instagram or don't know, I have a bit of a book club there, and I share books that either intrigue me or educate me and give you a basic concept and let you go and do the reading rather than me give you a book review. And I finally got around to reading Brad Stone's The Everything Store. Fascinating education experience, even for a guy who was in tech. And there, the two basic principles that I took from this book. Number one, every innovation, I don't care what it has been, every investment they have made at Amazon, it has been a direct focus on how can it benefit the customer. There's a direct line for everything. And second, and I would argue more important, they look at the time frame not on quarterly reports to Wall Street, but rather if you extend out the timeline, what can you accomplish? Fascinating stuff. But as it relates to here, I stood here, 2.5 years ago with a white XC90 T8 and shared the details of Volvo's all four-cylinder strategy. And for the most part, it works. Driving this car around, a D-segment luxury car, with a bit of sporting pretension, this is not a sports sedan, plenty of power, not at all underpowered. But it's in those real-world driving scenarios, particularly under load, that you very much realize that premium is way more than some intangible marketing mumbo-jumbo. Rather, it's very real, very tangible, and very much an asset. Which brings us back to the $62,000 US that this costs. You begin to think to yourself, what else could I get for the same money? Well, Mercedes E43, or more importantly, BMW 540, which brings us back to the Volvo all four-cylinder strategy and the Jeff Bezosian, is there such a word, an Amazon way of doing things. When they take a decision like that to innovate, it's about how does it benefit the customer, save money for the customer, make a better experience for the customer. Here I would argue, most customers, it works just fine. Matter of fact, it has plenty of power for most customers. However, if we're talking premium, I would argue there is a need for a different or an additional option. Whether that's internal combustion engine or EV, I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean by safety tech that perhaps is a bit too intrusive. So I'm kind of stuck into a corner here at a grocery store. I want to do some reversing. Let's say for the sake of discussion, I just wanted to get this into my garage. You really wouldn't have your seatbelt on when you're maneuvering it around in your garage or in your driveway. So let's say I take my seatbelt off, I put it in reverse. The car, it won't let me go. It puts the parking brake on automatically. So let's put my foot on the brake. I put the parking brake off again. It does the same thing. There is no way to do this if I hit the parking brake off again every time it goes on. The only way is to put the seatbelt on and then turn the parking brake off, and then I can actually do the maneuvering around my parking lot, my garage, my driveway. That, I feel, is just way too intrusive. So Kumo said for this series that it is strictly verboten for me to discuss any other stuff that I usually discuss in our standard episodes, but he didn't say anything about letting a little design nerd fall out. So I've been driving this, 8-9 days now, and I don't care where I have gone. You drive into a parking lot, step out of this thing, people, they don't know what to make of it. Like, hell, I even took this to Angel Stadium. People, I've never been to Angel Stadium, and there was a group of tailgaters that came over and said, what is that thing? And when I said Volvo, you could have sworn that I transported them to Dodger Stadium. So now we're going south on PCH, and not too much traffic as we look into Santa Monica over here. Great opportunity to unpack the interior, again, from a pragmatic point of view. And I'll admit, when we first drove this thing over a year ago, I let a lot of design nerd fall out, because this is one of the most beautiful interiors on offer today, bar none. I don't care what price point, what car company, what country, they just knocked it out of the park. And now that I've lived with it for over a week, it's even more stunning. And the thing that I notice is not so much just the beautiful tactile feel of the satin finish here or some of the design, it's where you sit. I didn't really notice this when we drove this in southern Spain, but notice I'm sitting low, and this is not because I'm deliberately putting the seat low. It's just the design of the vehicle. It's low slung, not something from like my growing up days of old 760s or even 240s. Remember flaxen yellow 240 wagons? You sat on top of those things like you're sitting on a bench looking down into all the other traffic. Where this, it's just, you feel like you're in a sports car, and man, you're in a Volvo. And then one thing I do have to point out that is not all puppy dogs and roses, it's the speed of the infotainment system. Like now it's running, like I'm switching between satellite radio, the different apps, but then it can simultaneously work in conjunction with the Apple CarPlay, so I can pull up the maps here from my phone, which is connected here. Now it's almost like it's warmed up. It's working. The speed is okay, but I've noticed now between two of these new Geely era Volvos that the speed of the infotainment system, when you start the vehicle up in the morning, it's not that quick. Like the XC90 I had before this, it was like normally slow. I think that one just needed a refresh. This one, it gets going, but slower than other infotainment systems like from like Hyundai, Lexus, where it's not quite as fancy, not quite as elegant. So you're trading the two UXs working in conjunction in one wrapper for a little bit of, I would say, reliability and speed from the processor. I don't know if this is a thing where they just need a faster processor, or perhaps a later refresh of the firmware, or even a software update from Apple or Volvo. So in our financial series of episodes, you've come to know me as a numbers geek. So you can imagine when Ford first came out with this whole big like EcoBoost thing, and they said, you wouldn't believe the fuel economy we're getting with the power in these new 4-cylinder engines. And I'm thinking to myself, well, my first car was a 4-cylinder turbo, and the fuel economy sucked when you put your foot into it. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe they got some secret sauce in there. So I drove a couple of them, put my foot into it, and sure enough, the fuel economy sucked. So I'm noticing this trend is everywhere else, and I think it's a numbers thing. It's so they can show the EPA these high numbers. They can rate for like a big car like this, above 30 mpg, but when you put your foot into it, which I've been doing, and you know that's what I do when I drive these cars, my average mpg driving around town has been 16.6. So that's a nice way of saying that your mileage will definitely vary. So as I spent more time behind the wheel of the S90, it's dawned on me, you and I have become ridiculously spoiled over the past couple of years. Like, do you remember when you and I were driving a lot of Audis together on the show, and how I went on and on about how they decouple the engine mapping, the throttle mapping from the suspension mapping? Well, here's an instance where we have all that adjustability on offer here. In fact, we've been driving this entire stretch of mode in the most basic blah celery mode. So let's change that. We're going to go to the dynamic mode. And in interest of full disclosure, 99% of the time I've been driving this thing has been in dynamic, which brings up my point of why we've been spoiled. I don't necessarily need the engine to be in full like fire-breathing mode because it does take a hit in the MPG. But I do want the suspension to be set up in dynamic. So my suggestion to Stefan and the crew over in Göteborg is to separate the mapping of the throttle and the steering from the suspension. So I could go into eco mode for the engine, driving it around town, get the higher fuel economy of a 4-cylinder, but still have the dynamic driving of the adjustable dampers, in this case, the air setup. So we lived with a Volvo S90 for an extended period of time. Is it like Forget Paris with Billy Crystal, or has Volvo deposited a glass elevator and a chocolate factory on my doorstep? Well, I would argue it's closer to the chocolate factory. I mean, it ain't perfect, but it's damn good. There's some things that will probably change or improve over the production cycle of this vehicle, those small things we talked about. But more importantly, it's that question of premium, or what I would say is more of an opportunity that's been left on the table. And I would argue that Volvo knows. Because in the past couple of weeks, they announced that they're taking Polestar, what you and I know as the AMG, the M, or the V equivalent in the Volvo world, and now spinning it out as an EV standalone startup. Now here's the thing. It used to be its own company up until 2015 when Volvo acquired it. Then they started collaborating more on the V60 and the S60 that you and I drove in previous episodes. But why do I think they get that there's an opportunity beyond this in premium? It's because the guy who's running it, not an engineer, definitely not a businessman, rather, he's a designer. And if you've watched us for the past 8 years, you know I've gotten to know a lot of designers, and they're the ones that invented premium. So with that, I'm going to turn this around to you. Do you think there is indeed an opportunity that is missed, and that there should be another offering? And as part B of that, should that offering be electric, or should it be another internal combustion engine, kind of like that the V8 that they had in the XC90 previously, or perhaps a V6, or another 5-cylinder? Whatever it is, let me know. And you know what? More importantly, let me know what you currently drive and if you think that is premium and why. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all in word, MotoManTV all in word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I want to leave you with two things. Number one, please unsubscribe, then resubscribe, click notifications. This is how much YouTube has screwed up the platform, almost as much as all these bugs around me right now. And number two, I want to leave you with a fun fact. So I shared with you that I am a Hollywood Bowl fan, and we had gone to the Hollywood Bowl in that BMW 760 as like a couple's play date. Well, guess what? We went to Hollywood Bowling again. But here, it wasn't Tony Bennett. We went to see Jewel. Now, I'm not a big Jewel fan, but I read her book, and I highly suggest that was actually on the MotoManTV book club, which you should watch. But I went there because of her book, not because of her music. And there was another guy that was gonna, I thought, open for her. His name is Chris Bodie, and he is a jazz trumpeter. And I love jazz music, but I really hadn't gotten into him in the past. Well, Jewel, she opened for Chris, and we're all scratching our head like, why is she coming out first? Then this guy comes out. If there was a roof, he would have blown the roof off the Hollywood Bowl. Then, as if you were already excited for this guy, he brings out this concert violinist who plays with Andrea Bocelli. Christine Chapman is her name. She came out, did a solo of Led Zeppelin on a violin, and then queued up the LA Philharmonic with their conductor. It was one of the most incredible concerts I've ever seen in my life. I am not making this up, and I've seen the Stones in concert. So I'm gonna say this. By the end of that concert, we're like, who was the opening act? Until we see you next time, bis später.